Well, hello and welcome to the Light Reading Podcast. I'm Jeff Baumgartner, a senior editor at Light Reading.
Awesome, Jeff. Good to see you. Dallas Dolen with PwC. I'm fortunate enough to run our technology, media and telco program here.
Great. Well, Dallas, good to have you on the podcast. I think, and we're here, I think, we have a kind of a timely reason to connect today as we're in the wake of, I guess, call it Liberation Day, but President Trump's sweeping tariff actions on April 2nd that included, I think it was a 10% baseline on all goods coming to the U.S. and then higher tariffs on products from other countries and regions like China and European Union. So I think a lot of the discussion coming out of that has been on the costs that American consumers will likely absorb. I know, PwC, we did a report on it. You came out with a forecast that included or indicating that tariffs could balloon from like 13 billion to 139 billion in the technology, media and telecommunications sector. And I think, that estimate came ahead of Liberation Day with more detail on the tariffs. So, given what we know now about the tariffs and the possible countermeasures, how does that change your view or alter it or enhance it? Kind of coming out of this now that we have more information.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I was in fact with about 9 companies last night at dinner, and I was asked to give some opening remarks. Kind of hyping the dinner up and making sure everyone was going to have a fun time. And obviously after approximately 28 hours of ability to download what had happened on Wednesday, that was a much taller task than it was when I agreed to do it about a month ago. But I think that the short commentary I gave to them, which I would reiterate here, is I think you're going to see largely an emotive reaction at first. Clearly, we're seeing that come through in the way the markets are reacting as well. The level of uncertainty is incredibly high, including what actually gets implemented. Right, we still have that fundamental question. If you watch really the minute by minute news, it's not even hour by hour, right, or day by day. The minute by minute news is individual country negotiations are ongoing, and there are chances that we'll have significant changes even to some of the things that were offered up on on April 2nd, including as of the time of our recording here, there was a conversation 45 minutes ago between the president and the leader of Vietnam about perhaps rolling back the tariffs there. So I think that's a good example of before we're too quick to reconfigure all the supply chains and all the numbers, we probably need to wait for actually everything to go into effect. The 140 billion approximately that we had computed, was based on a baseline tariff construct of somewhere between 10 and 25%. I don't think anyone anticipated the rollout of reciprocal tariffs nor the methodology for computing it. So both of those things have thrown another, we'll call it wrench in the fly, if you will, the flywheel of this whole thing. And, really the impact is much more dynamic, probably much larger, if we're just being honest with it, right? Like the potential impact is huge. But I'll also note, in the executive order that the president signed on April 2nd, he did have a specific carve out for, a number of items, right? Including, although not specific to tech, but including much of the automotive imports, at least, provided that they're compliant. But then also semiconductors. And I think both of those things are of critical importance because the potential, impact of semis, being hit by tariffs is probably the most significant, especially as we see in, just out the window behind me here are a lot of the consumers of semiconductors, just the largest 5 companies who own most of the data centers around the world said that they would spend approximately $300 billion this year in building out new data centers for AI. Or that figure alone, if you were to tack on a 10%, a 25%, or some type of reciprocally, computed tariff, for anything coming in from Taiwan, China, Korea, what have you, that 300 billion would be 400 billion, 500 billion, right? Depending on it. So that degree of, that would be certainly more than we computed, for the entire industry just in that one area. So I think the carve out for semis was really critical, but it doesn't mean that it's a pure windfall. There's still the anticipation of potential, tariffs on services too, which is still to come. But I think the number, if you were to sit down right now and do the math, the number is probably double the 180 that we're at, just based on reciprocals and based on everything else that's out there. And then, we'll have to see like what the carve outs are, because no one really is certain what the real math would be and what we're going to end up with starting tomorrow morning.
Right. So when you kind of put it all together, it feels like uncertainty is the theme right now.
Yeah.
It's like, we have kind of a sense of things, but if you're talking about carve outs and how that's going to impact the numbers, we still don't have enough detail yet to really get fine-tuned, what the impact is going to be.
Yeah. I mean, I would say this, maybe using a sports analogy, which, isn't always everyone's favorite, but we're probably an inning, we're like bottom of the first of a 9-inning game on trade reform. And by analogy, if you look at what's happened over the last, say, 25 years or so on taxes and the international tax community, just pure income taxes. You could throw in some of the transfer taxes and as well as digital taxes that are new constructs that have come out from the OECD. It took about 25 years for the international tax community and all the countries to really adjust their view of how they should tax intellectual property, manufacturing activities, consumer activities, what we call DEMPI functions, right? The things that were, fundamentally the value creating activities that were there. 25 years is a long time in terms of the enterprise community, right? We went from selling, software on disks, which was originally what was happening in 1998, 1999, when a lot of that first came up, to now, it's all cloud compute, it's SaaS, it's PaaS, it's infrastructure as a service. If you think about the transition and how long it's taken, the community to get it right as it relates to the same, and then you look at trade and say, hey, no one's really done this with trade. I mean, this hasn't happened, with trade in much longer than 25 years. That goes back to my point. Like, we're probably in bottom of first inning, on this whole conversation, and people aren't really sure where they want to end up, except we have an administration whose policy is they want to reshore manufacturing jobs at a time when there's a lot of uncertainty about what a manufacturing job is. And I think some of those issues are going to come up in the second and third and fourth and fifth inning before we even get to the landing spot of what is the actual right policy around this. And it may go longer than the entire presidency here, at least certainly this administration, in terms of ferreting it all out and solving for every country, because you're talking about well over 100 countries that we do trade with. So I think uncertainty is right, Jeff. I think that the timing for finding certainty is probably a lot farther out than people would want it to be. But hopefully we can bring some stability to it, which is, hey, what's like a reasonable rate and what's a reasonable approach to negotiating these things, and how do you get the international community working together to do that? Because inherently that's the reason that organizations like the OECD and the WTO and others exist.
Okay. Well, and kind of given that backdrop, then when we're talking about the technology, media, and telecommunications sector, as they're kind of looking at this, how do you think they're going to adjust, to the impact of some of the policies on a go-forward basis, at least on the belief that the tariffs will remain intact for the foreseeable future, and not knowing the result of any sort of negotiation that might be happening in the background right now?
Yeah. So a couple things. I mean, you probably still have a lot of folks, waking up the last couple of days trying to figure out what this all means, right? And not having a perfect view of what it is impact-wise to their company. If you look at the folks who can act quickly, they're the ones who probably began their supply chain diversification prior to even the current administration, who've been working on it for a couple of years, right? And there's a few companies who actively have, marketed that fact, right? Including those who've moved some manufacturing to India, move some manufacturing to Vietnam, right? And I'm speaking specifically of the supply chain that's, highly reliant on China, where the highest, reciprocal rates would probably exist for, for purposes of trade. So you have companies who can move faster because they've already gone through the actions of diversifying that supply chain. The one interesting angle is from just a pure consumer lens, like how quickly will we see price adjustments in the products that we buy. Right here, we're talking. I have this tablet device, and we're going back and forth. We have our phones in front of us, and we have our AirPods or other ear devices, what have you. I've heard some estimates of that of like as early as the next 4 to 6 weeks, we could see changes in the pricing on consumer goods as things start to work their way through the system, because not all of the end suppliers that we buy from are necessarily the importer of record, the ones to which the tariffs would apply. So that means it has to work its way through the system. It's not the same as like commodity pricing where, when you see oil prices go up or down, right? Like it's that direct effect. So you don't have that immediate direct effect, but car companies, I mean, credit to, I think it was Ford yesterday, they were quick to put out an advertising campaign to say, hey, we'll give you employee pricing on all of our cars. If you were to, come buy a Ford today, because knowing that they'll get out in front of the potential changes to price that'll come through on all the imported vehicles, by the way, including what are considered some domestic brands. So I think you'll see some companies take advantage of what's happening here because they have a, already diversified and or US heavy supply chain. And then you'll have everybody else, probably moving super fast to analyze and then figure out how quickly could they diversify and what does that mean?
Yeah, because I think that all ties into how are some of these companies going to mitigate the effects of the tariffs, and how quickly can they mitigate it, right? And I think in the report that came out from PwC, you got into areas like tweaking like trade and customs practices and making changes to the supply chain capabilities, right? And I mean, these are big ships to move in a way. It's not like
literally big ships to move, right?
Yeah, they're literal big ships. Yeah,
yeah.
And the but it's like you can't just change these things overnight. So I don't know. Do you anticipate that? I mean, they're already trying to figure out. Okay, we don't even with the uncertainty. Do we need to start? I mean, I'm sure they were probably having a lot of thoughts about mitigation strategies even ahead of April 2nd.
Absolutely. Well, I'll add one more thing in, right? I think you'll have, some internal cost cutting, maybe the indirect costs, right? What can a company do to, ensure that they meet at least some, something close to their targeted, profitability if they don't change, even if tariffs cause the input prices to go up or input costs to go up by 50%, companies may want to say, let's absorb 10, 15% of that total value. Where do I cut? And I think this is something that this goes into the media space, for purposes of marketing and sales spend, right? That's an easy place to go in and say, you know what I'm not going to do? I'm not going to run this sales campaign. I'm going to change the way that I go to market. I'm going to change these types of things. So the knock-on effect of tariffs to industries that are insulated, if you will, directly, right? Because you don't have a lot of the pure supply side coming maybe to a media company besides some content. The reality is they will get affected because their money-making model, except for those supply and subscriptions, is actually to sell ads. And so if your average, inbound car company, or obviously electronics companies or otherwise, have to cut spend, they'll cut spend there first because it's simple just to pull back on an ad campaign. And I think that's the knock-on effect that people are probably then secondarily most worried about. But if you live in the ads world like that, and if you're an ad agency as well, that's an area of really significant concern, especially as it's a separate point, but I think it's related. I mean, we don't have the strongest consumer right now, right? Like that's something that kind of flies under the radar a little bit. I mean, we've seen stock prices go up. We still see relatively strong, housing markets in certain areas, but consumer weakness has been an issue now for the last a couple of years, in part driven by the fact that you've had high inflation that's been caused by other monetary policy related issues and even fiscal policy, had nothing to do with tariffs before. You layer those tariffs in, which makes some things more expensive already against a weak consumer, that's going to be a real challenge. And so justifying a big marketing campaign or what have you, that's a huge risk. And so to the media companies in particular, that is a knock-on effect. And then telco is a double whammy, right? You have the huge infrastructure needs that they have, and continuing to modernize their entire network. You couple that construct with the fact that they are a consumer business for the most part. Obviously, they sell to enterprise, but they need to get out and get consumers to buy new devices, which are now maybe more expensive. Oh, by the way, their services, they'd love to increase the price of a service because of the infrastructure build out and capital spend that they have to make. The knock on for telco is it's going to be a really challenging, probably, next couple of years if, again, all this stuff goes through, but maybe if not, because again, you sort of have that weak consumer, regardless.
Yeah, yeah. Back to the uncertainty theme. It's like
Yeah.
it could be this bad, or maybe less bad, or even maybe even worse than we thought. I mean, it's kind of this.
Well, don't say that. Don't
spectrum.
say worse.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'd hate. Yeah, I just like at this point, you just don't know. But
Yeah.
yeah, and I think in some of the markets we covered, you mentioned this a little bit. There's going to be a lot of focus on, excuse me, how the tariffs will impact things like smartphones and we'll see how the semiconductor part of it factors into this, but perhaps that market will, or it'll slow demand, for those devices, or cause people to hold onto their devices even longer than they are now.
Yep.
So I guess time will tell. If the carriers, for example, will pass through those costs or absorb them and maybe take a hit on their earnings. But any additional thoughts in terms of how the tariffs might impact that particular segment of the market based on actually what we know at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I'll do some quick math here. I sort of alluded to it earlier. The capital spend that you had forecasted, by the large data center and platform companies was something on order of magnitude of like 320 billion. If you added up everything they said in their year end earnings calls. If you then go back and look at actual supply of chips and everything that's out there, the main suppliers, right, the big companies that we all know, they had revenue that was approximately half of that in the prior fiscal year. And so mathematically, I was always a little bit skeptical. Obviously, there's other things that go into data centers, right? There's actually constructing the facilities and there's power and there's other things. But I've been a little skeptical, Jeff, kind of going into this current year of, hey, I'm going to spend 75, I'm going to spend 80, I'm going to spend 65. It's like, I don't know if that supply exists. And certainly you have a number of challenges that actually had nothing to do with tariffs around ability to build out the supply chain in order to meet the demands that these companies had. My sense is companies could potentially use, some of the tariffs here as a reason to throttle back on that proposed spending. And in anticipation of the same, they probably, even knew when they were talking in January that some of these things were likely coming through and it would put some pressure on that. So, hey, let's put out, some type of number, but chances are we'll throttle back because the availability will be low. I think that's going to put some pressure. And then the other part of it is, if we're being really open-minded about the market, the demand for all those chips and semi was really driven in part by the demand to build out the AI infrastructure to supply, the broader market, including consumer enterprise with that. But as we've seen recently with some developments, perhaps the ability to supply AI could be done at a lot cheaper rate, perhaps with even cheaper chips. I mean, tough to say, but certainly the news out of China with DeepSeek was, quite the shot across the bow in terms of what does it really take.
Yeah.
Now, look, I take that a little bit with a grain of salt, but I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that this may change, this may reset the spend amount that's happening across the board on that, and it's bolstered by the fact that there's companies out there saying, hey, we can deliver equal, we'll say quality, equal experience for a whole lot less, and so then everyone else maybe adapts to it. net that might have been what they had to do anyway, because I don't know where they were getting the chips from unless they were bringing them from, Mars or Venus. That's a separate matter.
Well, I think Elon Musk, if you put something on Mars there, I think he might be happy with that and going to push his Mars agenda.
Touché.
Yeah, we'll have to see.
Touché.
Yeah.
Well played.
Yeah. So, all right, well, good. Well, I think the last thing was, maybe this is kind of more of a crystal ball question amid all the uncertainty, but, kind of given, again, what we know, what we don't know. What's like one thing you think is going to be the most important thing to keep an eye on in the coming weeks that'll have the biggest impact on like the TMT market?
Well, first, I'll go back to what I opened with. I think having some level of still positive outlook is really important here, and not to be overreactive, to what's happening, because I think that there's an ability to adapt, and if there's any industry that's shown an ability to adapt, better than tech, I don't know what it is, right? Like if you looked at the evolution that's occurred, almost everything that was a true standalone business before, whether it's photography or movies or music or transportation, all those things live as applications on a small device that we carry around in our pocket. And so, TMT kind of leads the way, if you will, in terms of ability to be adaptable and to evolve. So I think the first point is like, hey, there's tons of opportunity out there, and this is, I'll call it a blip and a reset, maybe on certain elements of where things happen, but not necessarily on the import and impact that the industry can have. The second thing is, I do think that reasonable minds will prevail in everything, including finding the net right result for purposes of where does the U.S. and other countries, where do they want to live on the supply chain, and where do they want to be in the value chain and the value creation around all industries. And the concept, the word I love more than any other is convergence. And if you really stop and think about what's happening in consumer markets with e-commerce, what's happening in banking around the electronic nature of banking, and oh, by the way, crypto and some of these other things that are there too, the convergence is a real construct. And I joke all the time with my industrial products friends that every company that they say is an industrial products company is more like a tech company to me. Whether they're launching rockets or building cars or producing energy, everything kind of creeps. And so at some level, I do think we have to look at all this and say, hey, small blip in road, but overall performance will continue to be incredibly high, and show adaptability and show some reasonableness of like, where do you want to play and how do you want to play in that space, and just be hard charging with it and work tirelessly to get to that point. And I think some of the companies that have done very well in the last couple of years, that's been their CEO mantra. And they've exceeded all expectations in terms of performance. And really, it's the same thing that we probably should take as it relates to trade and tariffs too. And look, we've run this gambit before, like I said, with tax policy. And we've gotten to a place where we largely understand the world there. I think we're going to do the same thing. I just hope it doesn't take 25 years. If it does, I'll be retired by the time that's over. That's okay. But nonetheless, it'd be nice if we figured it out faster than that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting point. Yeah. It is a very agile segment, of the industry. So maybe that's some good news beneath it all. So, okay. Well, great. Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on things, but I think that's where we're going to leave it for today, Dallas. So thanks for joining us on the podcast, talk about the very, very timely topic of tariffs. So definitely something we'll keep an eye out on and keep tabs on, and we'll look for additional insight from PwC on it.
Awesome. Jeff, thanks for your time. This was really a fun experience. Thank you.
Sure thing. Yeah. Thanks for joining us. All right.